Everyone joining today is muted, but if you have any questions during the presentation, you can send questions to us through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. If you need technical assistance, please send us a chat. We have posted our presentation and then transcript as a document, so you can download and follow along. Our presentation is also being recorded and will be posted on our website along with a transcript of the presentation. Okay, let's get started. My name is Ayaka and I'm the Accountability Coordinator. I have been with the department since 2011 and have gone through many accountability systems with you guys. It is great to have you all here today, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding accountability calculations. I'm excited to introduce 5 experts here with me today for any questions you may have. From the assessment and accountability, I have Kevin Chandler and Valerie Stefan, who can assist you with assessment and survey-related questions. From the federal programs team, I have Karen Say and Tyson Carter, who have been assisting schools in need and can answer questions related to school improvement support and funding. Last but not least, I have Michelle Clement-Taylor from School Choice, who is the biggest advocate for charter schools, alternative schools, and virtual schools. Let's get started. Today, we are going to talk about the Consolidated State Plan and COVID-19 Addendum. At the end, we're going to discuss next steps. The goal of this webinar for me is to empower you and encourage you to participate in the public comment period. The goal of this webinar for you to understand what is being proposed in the addendum. First, let's talk about the Consolidated State Plan itself. To better understand where we are, I'll provide you with some federal background. As you may be aware, in December of 2015, the Every Student Succeed Act, also known as ESSA, was signed by President Obama. This replaced the previous version of the law, the No Child Left Behind, which was enacted in 2002. In March 2017, the Department of Education released a revised template for the Consolidated State Plan under Section 8302 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, also known as ESEA, as amended by Every Student Succeed Act. On their website, the Federal Department of Education noted that the purpose of this release was to provide parents with quality, transparent information about how the ESEA, as amended by the ESSA, will be implemented in their state. The ESEA, as amended by the ESSA, Section 8301, also states that the purpose of the Consolidated State Plan is to 1, improve teaching and learning by encouraging greater cross-program coordination, planning, and service delivery. 2, provide greater flexibility to state and local authorities through consolidated plans, applications, and reporting. And 3, enhance the integration of programs under this act, meaning the ESEA as amended by ESSA, with state and local programs. To respond to the request and meet the requirement from the federal government, Idaho developed and submitted its initial Consolidated State Plan in August of 2017. The plan was then approved by the Federal Department of Education in March of 2018. In 2019, Idaho once again developed and submitted the first addendum, which was subsequently approved by the Federal Department of Education. What was approved by the Federal Department of Education in July of 2019 has been posted on our website. If you are interested in more detailed information, please follow the link posted on this slide. For those of you who are not interested in reading or do not have time to read this 116-page document, I am sharing the short description of the plan here. Basically, and in short, the plan has 3 parts. 1, how we report data. 2, how we identify schools in most need. And 3, how we support LEAs in schools. Basically, we tell the Federal Department of Education how we plan to meet their requirements through this plan. So you may wonder why we are trying to amend our plan again and now. There are 2 main issues that we would like to address through this addendum. First, we would like to address COVID-19 related data loss. Specifically, we did not administer ISAT IDAA in 2020. In addition, there was no penalty on not meeting the 95% participation rate last year. We also had previous disruptions, various disruptions, as you are well aware. We also realized our current plan have some methodological challenges. For example, we had over 100 schools identified as targeted support and improvement under our current plan, which was way over our capacity and allocated resources. The whole purpose of school identification, as we call comprehensive and targeted support, is to focus our effort and resources. Of course, we're here to support everybody, but if we are going to publicly call you out for needing comprehensive and/or targeted support, it is only fair for you that we provide you with the support you need to turn your school around. So you may ask, why should I care about this? It is because we like to build a plan that is valid and reliable, is transparent, and promotes mutual responsibility. We want you to understand how the school identification process works and how you can get support that you need to improve the system together. This could impact your school. Now let's talk about the addendum. Before I start, I want to clarify that what I'm going to discuss here today is proposed changes. This is important, and so I'm going to say that again. These changes have not been finalized. We are here today to discuss the changes proposed in the addendum with you so that you can digest them, have your own discussions with your folks, and provide comments by 5 p.m. Mountain Time on the 16th to tell us if you agree or disagree with proposed changes and how we can make them better. Please follow the link in this slide for more information on the public comment period. There are 4 key addendum points that we would like to go over with you today. First, we'll share the proposed changes to the school identification criteria. Next, we'll propose changes to the school identification exit criteria. We'll then propose how we are planning to use the 2021 ISAT IDAA, also known as ISAT Alt proficiency rate, as part of the school identification calculation. And lastly, we'll go over the 2019-2022 gross calculation as to how that might impact your school. You may have other great ideas, such as goals and targets or different gross calculations to improve our accountability system. Please know that the addendum that we are going to discuss here today, which is also known as COVID-19 addendums, as you can see in the footer, is only effective for the 2021-2022 accountability and school identification calculation. We'd love to continue our conversation on other issues and love to hear your ideas, but let's focus on those 4 key points today to better use our time together, okay? Before we take a deep dive into the proposed changes in the addendum, do you have any questions on the plan or addendum overview?
Yeah, Aika, there are no questions in the chat.
Thank you, Chandler. Okay, now let's talk about the addendum itself then. The first up is proposed changes to the current school identification system. As I discussed earlier, our internal motivation for the addendum is that we want to identify schools to which we can provide meaningful support. With the criteria outlined in the current plan, we publicly identified more schools than we can provide meaningful support. What is non-negotiable here is that we must publicly identify schools in need for the 2022 and 23 school year. So please know that we will not be able to respond to a comment like the department should get rid of school identification. Before I show you what is being proposed in the addendum, for those who are new or not familiar with the school identification process, I'll provide you with some background information. It is required by the Federal Department of Education that the state must publicly identify lowest performing, also known as CSI-Up schools, and schools with low high school graduation rate, also known as CSI-Grad school, for comprehensive support and improvement. School with consistently underperforming subgroup, also known as TSI school, for targeted support and improvement. And schools with low performing subgroup, also known as ATSI school, for additional targeted support and improvement. Both CSI-Up and CSI-Grad are identified every 3 years, and both TSI and ATSI are identified annually. Our focus here today is to explain how your school could be identified in one of these categories. If you want to learn more about what you get by being publicly identified as one of these schools, please contact Tyson after the webinar, who oversees the School Improvement Program. Okay, here is the 1,000-foot view of current versus proposed school identification methodology. When I say proposed, changes are being proposed in the addendum for your review. For CSI-Up identification, we are not proposing any changes. It is a composite score-based identification for all students group. We identify schools whose composite score is at the bottom 5% of all schools as CSI-Up. I'll show you what it's included in the composite score calculation in the next slide. For CSI-Grad identification, we're not proposing any changes either. It is grad rate based for all students group. We identify those schools whose 3-year average of 5-year cohort graduation rates is below 67% as CSI-Grad. Well, I need to clarify this. We used to use 4-year grad rate to identify CSI-Grad schools, but the current plan states that we will use 5-year grad rate starting in 2021, and therefore we're not proposing any changes to the plans through the addendum. For TSI identification, the current methodology is proficiency gap based for subgroup versus non-subgroup. We identify those schools with a subgroup whose proficiency rate gap with the corresponding non-subgroup is greater than 35% as TSI. When I say non-subgroup, for example, we evaluate proficiency rate gap for Asians versus non-Asians. The proposed methodology for TSI is much simpler and very similar to CSI. In the addendum, we're proposing TSI identification to be a composite score-based calculation like CSI. But instead of for all students group, we calculate composite score for each subgroup, and to identify those schools with a subgroup that is below the state all student composite score and are at bottom 5%. We are going to dive into this a bit more later. For ATSI identification, the current methodology is composite score-based for subgroups. We identify those schools with subgroups whose composite score is at the bottom 5%. In the addendum, we are proposing the same composite score-based calculation for subgroups, but instead of identifying the bottom 5% of all schools, we propose to identify the bottom 5% of TSI schools. Let's look into this a bit more later as well. Okay, let's talk about how we identify a composite score. First of all, composite scores are being calculated using 3 years of data. For K-8 schools or schools without grade 12, the composite score is being calculated using ISAT IDAA proficiency rate, ISAT growth toward proficiency, and ELPA growth toward proficiency. The weight is equally distributed such that if your school does not have any growth, meaning if your school does not have an adequate student population that goes into the growth calculation, for example, not having any English learners or students in grades 4 through 8, 90% of composite score only comes from ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. 10% comes from student engagement survey. For high schools or alternative high schools with grade 12, the composite score is being calculated using ISAT IDAA proficiency rate, 5-year graduation rate, and ELPA growth toward proficiency. Again, the weight is equally distributed. 10% comes from college and career readiness course enrollment, which is the first-time seniors who ever in grade 9 through 12 participated in advanced opportunities, received industry recognized certification, or participated in recognized high school apprenticeship program. For TSI and ATSI, we evaluate the performance of the following subgroups: economically disadvantaged students, English learners, major racial or ethnic group, students with disabilities. Okay, so here are the proposed changes outlined in the addendum for the TSI identification calculation. As I indicated earlier, we are proposing it to be a composite score-based identification. We calculate composite score for each subgroup within the same school category, meaning it was at grade 12, high school was grade 12, and alt high school. We then identify schools whose subgroup composite score is lower than the state level all student composite, and it is at the bottom 5% of school category and subgroup. It's pretty confusing, but in other words, your school is publicly identified as TSI if you have a subgroup whose composite performance is at the bottom 5% for that subgroup within the same school category, unless the subgroup composite performance is better than the state average for all students. You may wonder why the state level all student composite matters here. This is because we may have an outstanding subgroup whose bottom 5% is above the state average. Again, the purpose of school identification is to focus our resources and support. So I'm sorry that we will not be able to identify you if your subgroup performance is better than the state average. Now, here are the proposed changes outlined in the addendum for the ATSI identification calculation. To clarify, ATSI identification is already a composite score-based calculation. We calculate composite score for each subgroup within the same school category. In the addendum, we're proposing that we then identify TSI schools for ATSI whose subgroup composite score is lower than that of highest CSI subgroup composite. Isn't this bad? It looks super bad that one sentence includes 3 acronyms. So let me clarify this. Your school is publicly identified as ATSI if your school is already identified as TSI and your subgroup composite score is worse than the best of subgroup composite score among CSI schools for the same subgroup and same school category. To clarify, under this proposed plan, you will not be identified as ATSI unless you're already TSI. And if you're TSI, your performance will be compared against the best CSI player. You'll need to watch out as some of those CSI schools have great performance in some of their subgroups. Here's the TSI-ATSI identification key takeaway. We are proposing to use a composite score-based calculation for more consistent identification and to limit the number of TSI and ATSI schools so that we can provide meaningful support to those that are publicly identified. Do you agree or disagree with our proposal? Please submit comments through the public comment link. Before we move on to the next section, do you have any questions on proposed changes to the school identification methodology? I know I went over this pretty quickly and it's a lot of information to digest, but I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
One question. Can you please briefly explain how you are accounting for economies of scale and rurality? And then a follow-up question. Why is this not included in the composite score?
That's a great question, Elizabeth. We are still talking about how we going to identify economically disadvantaged status. That's what you mean by for economies of scale. Rurality, I guess we have never looked into that, but if you are interested, we can look into it outside of this addendum. Thank you for your feedback. Any other questions?
There are no other questions in the chat.
Okay. So now let's talk about the school identification exit criteria then. For the school identification exit criteria, our internal motivation is to exit schools that are ready to exit and serve schools in more need. What is non-negotiable here is that re-identified schools must receive more rigorous and resource-intense interventions, and we must publicly identify schools in need for the 2022-23 school year. We are afraid that by not exiting schools that are ready to exit, we will not be able to spend time with schools in more need because of the more rigorous requirement imposed by the Federal Department of Education. Before I go over what is being proposed for the exit criteria, I wanted to clarify that CSI-Up schools are eligible to exit after 3 years of intervention, and CSI-Grad, TSI, and ATSI schools are eligible to exit after 1 year of identification. Because we last identified CSI-Up, CSI-Grad, TSI, and ATSI schools for the 2018-19 school year and carried their status forward due to COVID, all of them are eligible to exit at the end of this school year. To exit CSI-Up status, a school must no longer meet the eligibility criteria and articulate in their school improvement plan for sustaining improved student achievement. The current consolidated state plan also indicates that the CSI-Up school must achieve ISAT IDAA proficiency rates above the 20th percentile among all schools with each school category for the all students group in ELA literacy and math in order to exit the CSI-Up status. We are proposing the 20th percentile to be lowered to the 10th percentile. This is because based on prior years of data, we saw a sustained improvement when schools achieved above 10th percentile in ISAT IDAA proficiency rates. For CSI-Grad exit criteria, we're not proposing any changes. CSI-Grad school must exceed 67% in the cohort graduation rate measure in 2 consecutive years for all students group or no longer meet the identification criteria. It's the same for both TSI and ATSI schools. The exit criteria remain the same as well. You can exit the TSI-ATSI status when your school no longer meets the corresponding identification criteria. Here's a CSI-Up exit criteria key takeaway. We're proposing to reduce the ISAT IDAA proficiency rate CSI-Up exit criterion from above 20th percentile to 10th percentile to exit schools that are ready to exit and serve schools in more need. Do you agree or disagree with our proposal? Please submit comments through the public comment link. Before we move on to the next section, do you have any questions on proposed changes to the school identification exit criteria?
There are currently no questions in the chat.
Thank you, Chandler. Okay, let's move on to the next section then, which is use of 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. Okay, so we're going to talk about the use of 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate as part of the school identification calculation. To clarify, IDAA is Idaho Alternative Assessment, used to be known as ISAT-ALT for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Our internal motivation for the addendum is that we wanted to credit but not penalize schools for the 2021 ISAT IDAA performance. What is non-negotiable here is that proficiency rates must be adjusted for not meeting 95 participation rate if we wanted to use it for school identification purposes. I'll walk you through what the proficiency rate adjustment means in the next few slides. As a background, we did not require a 95 participation rate last year. I hope that everyone is familiar with the 95% participation rate requirement. What it simply means is that 95% of students enrolled during testing window has to participate in ISAT or IDAA. Many schools did amazing and hit 95%. However, we understand that meeting this requirement last year was challenging for some schools due to COVID-19 related refusals and students and families facing other demands in their lives. We also did not apply proficiency rate adjustment rule based on participation rate last year. This requirement potentially reduces your proficiency rate based on your participation rate. As I indicated in the previous slide, this requirement is non-negotiable from the Federal Department of Education. We received a waiver last year from the Federal Department of Education not to apply this requirement on proficiency rates reported on our report card. However, they're telling us now that we must retrospectively apply this rule if we wanted to use the 2021 proficiency rate for school identification calculation. I'll discuss what this means in the next few slides. We also used Wyoming cut scores to calculate IDAA proficiency rate in 2021. That is, IDAA proficiency levels were calculated based on Wyoming standards. There is pretty close to the one adopted in Idaho. However, the question remains, should we or should we not use the 2021 proficiency rate for the school identification calculation? Now let's go over what the proficiency adjustment rule is. When calculating ISAT IDAA proficiency rate, the denominator for the ISAT IDAA proficiency rate must be calculated as the greater of a total number of continuously enrolled students who received a valid score on ISAT or IDAA, or 95% of total number of continuously enrolled students who are not exempt from the ISAT IDAA participation, regardless of their ISAT IDAA participation status. To further clarify for those who are new to this, continuously enrollment status is defined in the Idaho Administrative Rule by being enrolled continuously in the same public school from the end of the first 8 weeks or 56 calendar days of the school year through the state-approved spring testing administration period, not including the makeup portion of the testing window. So basically, if your student has been in your school since week 9, the student is considered continuously enrolled for accountability purposes. I'll give you an example here to better facilitate your understanding of adjustment rule. Say you had 120 students on the ISAT IDAA roster, and 100 of them were continuously enrolled since week 9. You only tested 90 of them in green. And your school has an outstanding performance, say such that all of them were in level 3 or 4. 10 continuously enrolled students were not tested in blue. So what do you think your proficiency rate is? 100%? It looks like 100%, but it is not under the proficiency rate adjustment rule. Remember, the denominator must be the greater of a total number of continuously enrolled students who receive a valid score on ISAT IDAA, or 95% of total number of continuously enrolled students who are not exempt from the ISAT IDAA participation, regardless of their ISAT IDAA participation status under the proficiency rate adjustment rule. So how does this work? By applying the proficiency rate adjustment rule, your denominator will be adjusted to 95 because 95% of 100 is 95. So your adjusted proficiency rate is 90 because 90 participated in ISAT IDAA, divided by 95 because 95 is greater than 90, which equates to 94.7%. Why does the Federal Department of Education require this? It is because we don't know how the remaining 10 students would have performed on ISAT IDAA. They want us to assume they did not meet proficiency. This rule doesn't just apply to all students group. This applies to any subgroups that are part of the school identification calculation. Was it a lot to process? In short, 2021 proficiency rate needs to be adjusted to be used for school identification. Adjusted proficiency rate is reduced if the corresponding group or subgroup did not meet the 95 participation rate. Because of this, here's what we are proposing in the addendum for the use of 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate as part of the school identification composite score calculation. First, calculate standard and safe harbor composite. In the next slide, I'll show you what this means. Next, identify CSI, TSI, ATSI schools based on standard and safe harbor composite separately. And lastly, finalize the identification only if a school is identified as CSI, TSI, and ATSI through standard and safe harbor way. So remember in the previous section, we discussed how composite scores are being calculated. This slide shows you the composite components for K-8 schools. For the standard composite, we averaged 2018, 19, and 2022 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. For the Safe Harbor Composite, we averaged 2019, 21, and 2022 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. The rest of the composite score components remain the same in both standard and Safe Harbor Composite. For ISAT growth toward proficiency, we averaged 2018, 19, and 22 ISAT growth. For English language proficiency assessment growth for English learners, we averaged 2019, 2021, and in 2022 access growth. For student engagement survey, we averaged 2019, 2021, and in 2022 survey results. We're proposing that we will only identify your school if your school is identified in both standard and Safe Harbor way. And this slide shows you the composite components for high school and alt high schools. For the standard composite, we averaged 2018, 19, and 2022 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. For the Safe Harbor composite, we averaged 2019, 21, and in 22 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate. The rest of composite score components remain the same in both standard and Safe Harbor composite. For 5-year graduation rate, we use average 2018, 19, and 2022 5-year graduation rates. For English language proficiency assessment growth for English learners, we averaged 2019, 2021, and 22 access growth. For the college and career readiness course enrollment, we averaged 2019, 21, and 22 enrollment data. We're proposing now we will only identify your school if your school is identified in both standard and Safe Harbor way. So here's the 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate key takeaway. We're proposing to identify schools only if both standard composite was 2018, 19, and 22 average proficiency rate, and Safe Harbor composite was 19, 21, and 22 average proficiency rate, result in the same school improvement status. Do you agree or disagree with our proposal? Please submit comments through the public comment link. Before we move on to the next section, do you have any questions on proposed changes to the use of 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate?
There is one question in the chat. Can you please clarify the continuously enrolled? It was my previous understanding that if a student enrolled after the 56th calendar day, they were not counted for proficiency, but were included for participation. Did I misunderstand?
That's correct. So if they were continuous enrollment status doesn't apply to participation rate calculation, it only applies to proficiency rate calculation. If a child is not continuously enrolled, child would not be part of proficiency rate, or participation rate calculation is whether the child is on the assessment roster or not. Any other questions?
There are no other questions in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. And it is pretty complicated because we talk about proficiency rates, and proficiency rate is adjusted based on participation rate. And so please let me know if you have any questions. You can send me an email later if you digest this, and if you come up with any questions, I'll be available and happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay, let's move on to the 2019-2022 ISAT growth as part of the school identification calculation. And our internal motivation for the addendum is that we did not want to penalize schools for the ISAT growth from 2019 to 2021 for the reasons discussed in the last section. What is non-negotiable here is that we must publicly identify schools in need for the 2022-23 school year, and K-8 composite score must include ISAT growth toward proficiency. I'm going to show you how this works without 2020 and 2021 ISAT scores. As the background, the indicator of ISAT growth toward proficiency is the percent of students who are on track to be proficient in 3 years. To be included in this calculation, a student must be continuously enrolled in the reporting school year, have 2 consecutive years of ISAT skill score, and advanced grade level in sequence. So yes, I said 2 consecutive years. And that was our original plan. The question is, what should we do now without 2020 and 2021 scale scores? So for 2018 and 2019 growth, we calculate growth as usual. And the reason why I'm referencing 2018 and 19 here is that the composite score is based on 3-year average, as we discussed in the previous section. 2018 growth is based on the ISAT scale score increase from 2017 to 18, and we ask, was the gain enough to be proficient by 2020? 2019 growth is based on the ISAT scale score increase from 2018 to 2019, and we ask, was the gain enough to be proficient by 2021? And for the 2022 growth, we're proposing that it will be based on the ISAT scale score increase from 2019 to 2022, and we ask, was the gain enough to be proficient by 2024? Let's take a look at an example to better facilitate your understanding. This student who was in grade 3 in the school year 2019 scored 2,357 on ISAT ELA literacy. Now the student is in grade 6, and say the student score was 2,459 on ISAT ELA literacy. You can see that increase in blue line in the graph is the progress that student made from 2019 to 2022 enough to be proficient for this student to be proficient by 2024. And you can see in the graph that there's a target grade 8 proficiency cut score of 2,668. So how do we calculate this mathematically? We identify actual score gain and expected annual scale score gain and compare the actual to the expected. It is obvious by plotting into a graph if the student is on track or not. In the current pace, the student doesn't seem to reach proficiency by 2024. But for this example, the actual annual scale score gain was 34 points. On the other hand, the expected annual scale score gain was 62.6 points. Is 34 bigger than 62.2? The answer is no. So we conclude that the student is not on track to be proficient by 2024. I'll give you a different example. This student who was in grade 3 in the school year 2019 scored 2,357 on ISAT ELA literacy. Now the student is in grade 6 and say the student score was 2,600 on ISAT ELA literacy this year. Is the progress that student made from 2019 to 2022 enough to be proficient by 2024? Remember, we identify actual annual score gain and expected annual score gain for proficiency and compare the actual to the expected. For this example, the actual annual score gain was 81 points. On the other hand, the expected annual scale score gain was 62.6. Is 81 bigger than 62.2? The answer is yes. So we conclude that the student is on track to be proficient by 2024. It is important to consider who would be part of the growth calculation under the proposed model. Because as I indicated earlier, a student must be continuously enrolled in the reporting school year, have 2 consecutive years of ISAT scale score, and advanced grade level in sequence. For 2018 and 19, we would calculate growth for grades 4 through 8. However, because students this year have to have ISAT scale score in 2019, and ISAT is administered only on grades 3 through 8 and 10, and also a target cut, the student has to have a target cut score in 2024, we can only calculate growth for grades 6 through 8, as you can see in the table. So what does this mean? What this means is that if you are elementary school serving grades up to 5, Your post-COVID growth will not be included in the school identification composite score. But if you're a middle school serving grades 6 through 8, your composite score will include post-COVID growth. And your composite score will be compared against those of elementary schools serving grades up to 5, whose composite score does not include post-COVID growth for school identification. Do you agree or disagree with our proposal? Please submit comments to us through the public comment link. Before we move on to the next section, do you have any questions on proposed changes to the 2019-22 growth calculation?
There is a question in the chat. How would the growth work for schools that are 6 through 12?
Thank you, Mary, for the question. For the composite scale score for high school with grade 12, we don't include growth. So if you are in high school or a school serving grade 12, the composite score does not include growth. The growth calculation will be available to those schools that are part of high school category, but will not be considered part of the composite score calculation. Any other questions?
How might this play out for very small elementary populations?
So in order to be part of the composite score calculation, you'd have to have a student size of 20 for 3 years. If your school is really small, we would not be able to calculate growth. That means going back to the last section, we would need to calculate composite without growth. And so for elementary school, that means is that if we didn't have ISAT growth, that the composite score would only include ISAT IDAA proficiency rate and ELPA growth.
Okay, just a follow-up comment on that. So the middle school portion is calculated without the elementary scores, since the students are not in elementary for us.
I'm trying to understand your question here. We will not break down your schools into different portions. If your school as a whole serves grade K to 12, you'd be considered high school. We'll not calculate different identification for elementary portion and middle school portion. It's how many grades you offer, and if your school offers grade 12 or not is the question that we wanted to ask here. Does that help, Mary?
Ayeka, this is Michelle. Mary's school is 6 through 12. So I'm assuming, if I remember correctly, they have the high school requirements. And is that correct?
Yes. So if your school is grade 6 through 12, we would put you as high school, and your school will be identified based on high school composite score structure. So that doesn't include growth. Does that make sense? Okay, it says this is clear now. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And Elizabeth, you said the same 20. It doesn't have to be the same 20. It could be different 20, but it could be same 20 if you're talking about small school, because we're looking at different 3 years of data. I hope that helps. Do you have any other questions?
Ayeka, do you want to briefly mention that we do qualitative review for the really small schools?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So if a school doesn't have any data to be part of the composite score calculation, we have a separate review process that's called qualitative review process. And we have a group of folks who look at the school performance to decide whether the school should be part of the school identification school improvement status or not. Do you have anything to add, Tyson or Michelle?
I think I would just add that it's, they may have some data, but it's not, it's for those schools that Elizabeth was asking about that are really small, that maybe they don't have enough students to garner enough data or to have all of the different indicators. So
thank you. And Elizabeth, you said it would be helpful if we could see the details of this process. You meaning on qualitative review process? Yeah, that definitely needs to be available to you guys for sure. Anything else? Well, thank you, Karen. It says the qualitative review process is described in a consolidated state plan. The link is posted on our slide. Okay.
Follow-up question. Talk to us, please, about the K through 12 schools and the identification criteria for them.
Yes, thank you for your comment, Deb. K-12 schools will be identified as high school because it has grade 12. So then the composite score will be based on high school criteria. And as we discussed earlier, that includes ISAT graduation, ISAT proficiency rate, graduation rate, ALPA growth, as well as college and career readiness course enrollment. Any other questions?
No other questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the last section, which is the next steps. Here's the timeline for the addendum. We'll close the public comment period at 5 p.m. Mountain Time on Wednesday, the 16th. We'll amend the addendum based on your comments, present it to the state board for their approval, and submit it to the Federal Department of Education for their approval in April. We cannot guarantee that what we propose today will be accepted by the state board or the Federal Department of Education, but your opinions are very important to us. So this is just, again, a reminder that please submit your comments regarding the proposed changes by 5 p.m. Mountain Time on Wednesday, the 16th. And here's a summary of what we are looking for in public comments. Do you agree or disagree with the proposed changes presented today, including TSI, ATSI identification criteria, CSI-Up exit criteria, use of 2021 ISAT IDAA proficiency rate for identification, 2019-2022 ISAT growth for identification. Please use the link in the previous page to submit your comments by the 16th. And lastly, if you'd like to see what we discussed today and any additional more detailed information, please visit the link posted on this slide, including current report card link and business rules from 2019, 21, and 22 in draft. Do you have any other final questions?
Okay, a couple of questions in the chat. Is there a breakdown on how much of these components count on the K through 12 schools?
Yeah, so that was in the slide, previous slide of showing different components. Looking over, going back to slide 22, which include ISAT, high school and old school, 3-year average and 90% equal distribution for ISAT IDA proficiency rate, 5-year graduation rate, and ALPA growth toward proficiency, and 10% for college and career readiness course enrollment. Is that what you mean by the breakdown? And for, so are there ISAT grades 3 through 8 included? I think what you mean, Dev, is for K-12 identification. ISAT grades 3 through 8 would be included if that was part of your school grades offered, because ISAT is still part of the high school identification criteria. And please explain what difference the proficiency exit criteria make 10 versus 20 percentile when it appears that it takes about 40% of proficiency to get out of the bottom 5%. It takes about 40% proficiency to get out. Okay, so yeah, the percentile is not the rate itself, it's the ranking, and we're just looking at bottom 10% and bottom 20%. So we're suggesting that reducing bottom 20%, 10%, but it doesn't really translate into the actual proficiency rate itself. It could be 40% proficiency, or if everyone did great, and it could be much higher or it could be much lower. We don't have the actual proficiency rate. We're only talking about percentile. Hope that helps. And Dennis, did you say that didn't help?
Yes, that still is not very clear on the 10th and the 20th percentile to get out was kind of like a second criteria in addition to being out of the bottom 5%, from my understanding.
Well,
the
yeah,
bottom 5% in ELA last year looked like it was going to take about a 40th percentile for 40% proficient to get out of that bottom 5% last year.
Yeah, so when we were talking about, thank you, Dennis, when you talk about bottom 5%, we're talking about the composite score criteria. So so the re-identification is right, because in order to exit CSI-Up status, you cannot be re-identified and also hit the proficiency rate exit criterion, which we talked about 10th percentile versus 20th percentile. And so it is confusing that when we talk about bottom 5%, we're talking about composite score, which includes proficiency rate, growth, and survey. But in addition to that, we are also look at proficiency rate ranking to see where you are, if you're at bottom 10 percentile or bottom in the current plan it says 20 percentile, but we wanted to reduce it to the 10th percentile. And if you think this is confusing, if you think that the actual proficiency rate should be spelled out, please make a comment in the public comment link, please. And that's a great feedback. Thank you. Do you have any other questions? We'll wait a little bit so you can digest, and maybe you have any additional questions that we can answer. I don't see any additional questions. Well, thank you everyone so much for participating in this webinar, and please feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions. Have a great afternoon.